So I want to do a video, this one of course, on the Big Bang, covering arguments I haven't covered before. I already did another video on the Big Bang proving that it is wrong. So here is some guy who said this, which you can read if you pause. I don't have much time, so I'm just gonna let you pause to read it on your own if you want to. I'm going to dig through over 100 comments to check if you answered all of my questions, but let me see your arguments. So he said, if there were no Big Bang and the universe were not expanding, the recessional velocity of galaxies we observe, which is a lie, would not be proportional to their distance away from us. You haven't proven that we observe any velocity of galaxies. You're assuming that the only good way to interpret redshift is by the Big Bang story. That's circular reasoning. We said, redshift is not due to diffraction. We account for the diffraction from dust. It doesn't have to be dust, though, to be clear, I said to him. Then he said, however, that is not even necessary because diffraction does not change wavelength, he claims. Diffraction bends different wavelengths to different angles. False dichotomy, it does both. When you see a red sunset, you see diffraction. For example, the light of the sun has to go through more stuff to get to the viewer from that angle. So more stuff in the atmosphere in the way equals a shift to the red. There, that is so obvious, it is literally red. This is basic physics that you're denying, and visible, unlike the Big Bang. You're throwing empirical physics, real science, out the window to cling to your atheist creation myth. The indoctrination is strong with you. I was taught to believe in the Big Bang, but I question what I was taught. And you don't understand diffraction enough. For a wavelength to have to go around debris means it has to use more energy to travel a greater distance than if there were just a direct route with no detour. Detours require more energy. More energy spent means loss of energy, ergo a lengthening of the wavelength, ergo redshift. He said, does not alter the wavelength, which is a refuted claim. A simple home experiment with the diffraction grating or the back of a DVD can show that, he claims. You don't explain this experiment exactly, a bit ambiguous there. The back of a DVD diffracting light to show a lengthening of the wavelength functions as a mirror. Mirrors aren't the equivalence of dust, so that's a false equivalency fallacy. Moreover, actually, hold on. This might be a bad argument on my part because, yeah, there is diffraction with a DVD on the back. But in that case, you have a rainbow, basically. You have all the colors, so you have all the wavelengths, which shows that different angles or different angles. I'm not sure how a DVD is microscopically, but the more that light has to bounce through the grooves, I assume it has, the more of a shift towards the red there should be, because there's more energy loss, which lengthens the wavelength. So maybe this was a bad argument on my part. I rushed, so because it's midnight almost. So sometimes I make mistakes, but if I do make mistakes, I correct myself. Regardless, yeah, this was a bad argument on my part, but I corrected it and I explained how hold on, does not alter the wavelength. Back of a D can show that, but it does alter the wavelength because you see different colors, which shows different wavelengths, So from light that looks white reflected upon the back of a DVD, that gives you a bunch of different colors like purple, yellow, green. I mean, it depends on the exact situation, but it's usually like a rainbow. And that means different wavelengths, which come about because of the diffraction. Yet he says that diffraction does not alter the wavelength. He gave an example. He backfired. He gave an example of diffraction altering the wavelength, not just in one case, but in a rainbow of cases. Wow, he backfired there. So he says redshift causes the wavelength to stretch. I told him, you're putting the cart before the horse. Redshift is the effect of wavelength stretching. This does, how does the effect cause the cause? It's backwards. He's backwards. He says the Doppler shift. You mean the Doppler effect, to use the conventional term? You show an unfamiliarity with the concepts, which is ironic considering that he said, let me know if you have further misconceptions. Misconceptions is what he's full of. Where am I? So, and this is corroborated by your telling me you just did a Google search at face value. Because he said, a cursory Google search can verify this information. In other words, he couldn't answer the question, so he went to Google to find the closest thing that resembles the appearance of an answer, but all of his attempts fail because they're bad arguments and nonsense, and I'm not even finished covering the worst of his arguments. Let me see, or even beginning the worst, but they're coming, God willing. So you just did a Google search at face value, as if Google had more valid answers than misinformation. Google is full of contradictory answers. You err in trusting the so-called scientific establishment as if it could not err. Is there anything the establishment teaches which you reject? This is a test of gullibility. Of course, he doesn't reject anything that they teach unless they stop teaching it and say that they no longer believe it. Then he agrees with them. So the only time he's against the establishment would be when he is against the previous form of the same establishment, in which case he's still following it, but just the more modern form. Additionally, the constellations do not disprove expansion. So I said, relatively static things in space do not disprove spatial distortion, you claim. So static does not disprove lack of static. So he says A does not contradict the lack of A. He contradicts himself. That's like saying that bombing a house won't move furniture around. You really want to believe in the Big Bang, fit in and feel like atheists or heretics have a point. He says stars are close. No. The galaxy is gravitationally bound together, such that the expansion of space cannot tear it apart. So you're saying that the magic of gravity just happens to, universally at that, counterbalance the expansion, even with acceleration or deceleration accounted for perfectly to give the illusion of no expansion. Wow, convenient plot device. But that's unscientific and akin to saying leprechauns are real, but they disappear whenever we look their way. He says furthermore, the constellations were named only recently. Cosmological processes are very slow and take a long time, usually many billions of years. Another convenient plot device. Millions of years alone aren't enough for a constellation to distort or break. That's like saying, Your Honor, the fastest cameras cannot capture when that black man stole my wallet. But he did because the scientist I paid to say so says so. Scientists are paid shells when they follow the crowd. They get funding to support the status quo. They claim otherwise, but you see what they do, and actions speak louder than words. I'm planning to do a video on your arguments to highlight how indefensible this atheist creation myth is. Satan owns your mind. You don't think for yourself. You just follow the crowd.